we'll start with our gratitude to Andy for sharing this particular song in the chat. And let's just get started. So, first of all, welcome everyone to Module 7, which is the gift, which is technically our last block of kernel before we decided to extend it by 1 week and make the next week's fireside the last fireside. So, effectively, this week's fireside is usually the last fireside as we try to end with the gift. And we couldn't have imagined a better fireside guest today than Aaron Maniam. Aaron is with us here in the chat. And Aaron, can you say a brief hi to everyone before we go into the conversation later?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Great to be here.
Yeah, so I just asked Perplexity to cover the gamut of things that Aaron has been like invested in for all his life. And as you can see, like it's like all over the place in terms of like covering each aspect of society. And like we'll go into all these things in a bit more detail today. So like it's really helpful for us to understand things from the other side as well. Like in Web3 and crypto, we try to sometimes take a more cypherpunk stance where we try to criticize governments and like try to find better alternatives. But Aaron has had the privilege of trying to rethink these systems from within those circles, and his work on policy and technology and many other things and on strategic futures for humanity has helped him like contribute to that part of emergent society. So we'll get into all these things and how it relates to his passion for poetry and the spirit of gifting. So before that, I would like to hand it over to Vivek for a few slides to just share about what KB9 is, where we all come from, and to help phrase the spirit of this particular module with everyone.
Thank you, Sid. And thank you, Aaron, for being here. And thank you, everybody, always for joining for Fireside. It's always kind of like the highlight of the week. And Aaron, for your context, Kernel comes from a tradition of dialogue where the hope is in Fireside and also in the 9 weeks that it feels kind of like one long ongoing conversation. And we've been lucky to be in conversation with a really special group of about 150 overall. Today on the call, we have about 30, and each of them has shared their voice with us and kind of their ideas with us. Everyone kind of comes into Kernel with a craft or an idea, something that they're shaping, and as themselves with a background. And our goal is to get to know them. And I think we've been lucky to be able to do so. Yeah, we're not in the last week, but it is never too early to just kind of look back and say, okay, well, these are some of the intros, some of the things that we were doing at the beginning of the block. And these are some of the ideas that we started off with, some of the hellos in the intro channel. And it's just cool as a brief moment to look back and say, like, a lot has happened since the introductions in weeks 1 and 2. And the gratitude channel is a really good way to see that. So we encourage people as they met others in Kernel, as they started dialogues, as they ran into people that were doing things of similar interest, or maybe things that were completely different from what they were up to just document it in this type of a channel. And we've been lucky to see that happen and unfold. So we're at the week of the gift. I think Aaron will be really well equipped to help us understand this idea, this spirit of the gift that we've been pointing to with this module. And the only place I'd like to start with is just by saying, there is a spirit of the gift that is different, and the nature of it is something worth considering and worth exploring. So hopefully we'll have a chance to do that today. Thanks, Sid, and thanks, Aaron, for helping us to do so.
Yeah. Thank you, Vivek. Like to start with the spirit of gifting, like all the crafts, artifacts, people, and the memories that you see on the slides today are like all thanks to the fellows that we have had over the last 9 blocks. And this has helped us with like creating this community of care throughout the world where everyone who travels to any part of the world can like just say hi and meet Kernel people and just meet the fellows and like share the magic of a meal together. And we try to encourage and support that. And on in terms of crafts, there are people who dabble in actual physical crafts as well. So a lot of us come from different backgrounds, and like the two uh, images that you see on the bottom right are like crafts which people have started making like from scratch. So this chessboard from sand has been built from scratch, like starting from chopping the wood from the tree to like every step of the woodwork process and so on. So we'll have a lot of these conversations in terms of how gifting plays a role in all of this. For example, this chessboard was a gift from San to one of his kids. And in the spirit of gifting, like I'm also wearing a shirt, which is a gift from my loving wife. So we are all surrounded by these particular gifts. And all of these will culminate in two events, which we'll have the next week, which is the Kernel Showcase, where all these fellows will be sharing all their crafts that they have worked on. And we'll follow it up with a block party on September 13, which will be an open mic celebration where everyone is welcome, including you, Aaron, to share a piece of craft or poetry or art that you love and possibly create it. So we look forward to both these events and like reflect on the journey that we have taken so far. So as I briefly get into the module, like we'll just summarize what we have been through in terms of understanding the concepts of trust, value, freedom, the global financial system, incentives, and internet age institutions, how to take back the web, and how to design principled institutions and scaling principles effectively. And finally, we are at the week where we discuss all things related to giving and gifting and gratitude. So we'll try to understand and get into the nitty gritty of all these terms. I would have started with the module itself, but I want to celebrate one of our fellows, Sam from Web3 for Good, who submitted this as part of her kernel application before entering KB9. So the best I couldn't have imagined a better beginning for this. So she starts with Lewis Hyde's exploration, where the gift economy is a realm where value circulates freely and where we give without expectation and engage in a dance of reciprocity, and where the flow of generosity and gratitude sparks a harmonious cycle. And she ends it up with a particular quote from one of her favorite poems, which we also love a lot, which is C.P. Caffey's poem Ithaca, in which it says, Ithaca gave you the marvelous journey. Without her, you wouldn't have set out. She has nothing left to give you now. And if you find her poor, Ithaca won't have fooled you. So the gifts that arise from the process of gifting and gratitude are unexpected, unchosen, yet essential for both the journey and the outcome. And we'll get into how poetry plays a big role in all of that in the next slides. So as we talk about gifting, like it's very easy to identify that fields like art, pure science, education, healing, and generally things related to public goods are things which not do not necessarily fit well within our current economies. If we care about them, we need to have dialogues around developing institutions or practices which convert this real money into gift money. And a way to do that is to either study exchange economies and gift economies, but also inculcating that spirit within ourselves in the form of cultivating gratitude and becoming comfortable with our own needs, which are the keys to receiving gracefully. And how do we cultivate gratitude? Like according to the module, we have written that the act of giving itself does not create gifts. It's only when it is received in good faith that a gift truly exists. And next, we have to focus on how to scale these principles and treat gifts as native institutional protocols. So to do that, we need to understand how to explore truth using shared tools. And these were the things we have covered in the blocks until block number until this particular week. And exploring this truth with shared tools and remembrance helps us fuel lifelong learning and helps us scale ability across the species and the ability of gifting and gratitude as well. Then we focus on this beautiful module, which is the gift of no paradigm is perfection. So if you go into the module, the first particular module on the gift is a conversation with Lewis Hyde, where we talk about how gift creates a connection between the giver and receiver, how gift exchanges have wider circulations, and it's a different, it helps produce a different sense of what property is. And when property circulates as a gift, it increases in value and it bestows liveliness. So we talk about gifts from a more um, like realistic standpoint as well in these particular modules, and how we need to redefine the paradigms of language and the inertia of language with in which we phrase these particular terms. So this particular section delves into the whole concept of paradigms and how when paradigms are referred to as mere paradigms, their whole power collapses. So how do we navigate that? So there's a large focus on like how to navigate this whole idea of perfection and inculcating better language, and what better place to cover that than poetry. And one of these modules from the previous week talks about like poems, and that is what I want to focus on in the next particular slides. And it's an interesting trend. While the search hits and the popularity of gifting has only skyrocketed over the last many decades, like especially because of like using terms as gifting as a love language and gifting in our commercial economies, the trends for gratitude, which shares roots with Latin for gratis and means thankful and pleasing and means goodwill. The trends for gratitude in our literature have been dipping in recent decades, and but they have been seeing a sharp uprise recently. So we are in a very special place in humanity right now, and especially because of the advent of technology, we have had this ability to have these odes to code and the ability to stand on the shoulder of hacker giants, where the whole hacker culture started as gift culture. And this is very well represented by Eric Raymond's articles in the Cathedral and the Bazaar, in which there are principles of open source, peer-to-peer, regenerative aspects. And Eric writes that gift cultures are adaptations not to scarcity, but to abundance. And they arise in populations that do not have significant material scarcity problems with survival goods. And in gift cultures, social status is determined not by what we control, but by what we give away. And that's why, like Andy, who is Crypto Wanderer, one of our stewards, writing all these poems to help us understand these principles and expressing himself has been like a big source of gratitude. And we owe a lot of like understanding and kernel to him through all these modules. So this brings us into like the very important section where we celebrate poems, like which in the light of all the technical articles of all the policies in the world and all the like nitty gritty of many of the concepts that the world is governed by. It's poems and art and craft that helps us speak to and from a place that belongs to us, the elusive pitch that some might call the soul, the psyche, the sub or unconscious. And we believe it's there because we feel it working, but we are powerless to tell it when or how or even why it works. And like this is something I think all of us have felt as we started interacting with more and more advanced tools, both in Web3 as well as emerging aspects of the web, like AI tools and so on. So this is something that we would like to explore with Aaron as well later on. And one of the best aspects of gifts is that each one of us is blessed with unique gifts based on like the conditions in which we were born in, like our unique gifts in the universe, and how we interact with each other and make sure that these gifts continue to be lively flows of many, many blessings. And with that note, I want to introduce QZ, who is one of our peer mentors since KB5, who has been trying to create these cultural commons and is a common friend with Aaron and me. And we have stewarded a similar conversation in Gitcoin in the past. So QZ, if you want to share more about like how we are trying to create these
Okay.
ideas, like we would love to hear that.
Sure, it sounds good. And I think the interesting thing is, and nice to see you again, Aaron. It's been what, 10 years? Okay, I used to work at the Civil Service College at an organization called the Center for Applied Simulations and Training, called CAST, a name that only someone like Aaron can come up with, I think. And we used to do serious games, and that was like so long ago. And it's incredible to see you again. So nice to meet you. In a different context, welcome to Kernel. So I'll share a little bit about uh, what we're doing with Ethereum Singapore this year. And it's quite an honor to be hosting it at the Art Science Museum for this year's edition of Ethereum Singapore. And I think for us, it's incredible to see how we have this very rare opportunity to create a public education exhibition on the history of Ethereum. So we recently had a media day, and folks were like, "Oh, hasn't Ethereum been in museums? Or things on Ethereum?" And I realized that there is a stark difference between applications and like technologies and like NFTs that are built on Ethereum, and also Ethereum's story itself, which hasn't actually been told. And so, if you do have the opportunity to come for Ethereum Singapore this year, I would love to host everyone to come down to the Art Science Museum, and you get to hear Ethereum's story itself, starting from its beginnings in Bitcoin to when Vitalik posted the very first kind of like forum post on the Bitcoin Talk forum describing Ethereum, and all the way to the very end of the exhibition where people get to collect a POAP, POAP, to commemorate their time at the exhibition. And this is actually the first time ever that Ethereum's history and story has been told in any museum. And I'm really glad it's happening in Singapore. And thank you, yeah. And because of this really rare opportunity, we get to also host the rest of the Ethereum community at the Art Science Museum during F1 week, otherwise known as Token 2049 week. But as a Singaporean, I think F1 takes primacy. So I think what we mean when we discuss cultural commons, it's that for somebody who has been in the Ethereum space for some time, it's very hard and difficult to find the right kinds of spaces for us to essentially create some kind of like a welcome story for folks to feel that same feeling that we did when we first joined this ecosystem. I think when folks come down for Token 2049, for F1 week, for Eat Global Singapore, which is also at the same venue, and they realize that there is an ongoing exhibition on Ethereum's history, I hope it can remind them of why a lot of us joined this space in the first place, and also help them take the plunge and to reconnect with a lot of the different cultural aspects that make Ethereum the way it is. I think a key part of that is the philosophy of subtraction and the vision of an infinite garden, something that Aya Miyagachi, the executive director of Ethereum Foundation, uh, shares a lot as a direction that hopefully we can collectively grow towards as an ecosystem, which is Ethereum. And we do that in every way. How we open up the Art Science Museum for different Ethereum communities and protocols like Arbitrum, the ShiFi Summit is happening there. Live Pier will be there. All these different projects to come down into one of the most iconic places in Singapore and to celebrate what Ethereum is in the middle of one of the most hectic weeks of this industry. I think that's something that I really look forward to in the next 2 weeks. And yeah, I'm really excited, and thanks for having me again.
Thank you,
So
QZ. Thank you.
also
Yeah.
for folks on Kernel, I think Sid is helping to coordinate this, right?
Yeah, yeah.
As community partners to come down for our uh, conference slash festival. Uh, we wanted to take a very different approach to this. Like rather than just, sharing with fellow community organizers or Ethereum protocols or Ethereum like event organizers, we wanted to really take this chance to curate something that the museum does really well, and convene different communities that are coming down to Singapore and hopefully find that common thread, and also create a safe space for a lot of people. Uh, you think you understand when you're actually here how crazy it can be during Token 2049, and hopefully get to reconnect with people that still feel inspired. Yeah.
Thanks, QZ. Thank you. We are all looking forward in this, the people in this region at least, some of us who have joined this call at 11:20 um, 4 p.m. right now. So like respect to all of you for staying up late. So look forward to seeing all of you during this particular week, 16 to 22nd September. And the whole idea of phrasing Singapore as an infinite garden and the way we can play infinite games in the spirit of gratitude and gifting makes it very relevant for like QZ to come to this particular session and share his gift with all of us. And the one thing in common with all of us here is that people like Aaron, people like QZ, and many people at Kernel have worked in all these intersections of society, which is technology, economics, policy, and culture, and how these aspects are interdependent and how each one of these impact each other. So just in the context of Singapore, like all the educational certificates, vaccine certificates in Singapore use Ethereum blockchain using a technology called open source to issue all these certificates. So this is one of the non-financial applications of crypto, which is one of the first things I share with people when people ask about, isn't crypto just about number go up and Bitcoin and the price of different tokens and things like that? So every time we have to like verify our certificates and show our certificates, like open certs comes in handy, and that becomes like a like very wonderful advertisement for like using blockchain in this particular context. And the whole aspect of like Aaron's work over these years has been in the realm of understanding different kinds of goods. So I'll just briefly state like how to phrase public goods in the context of gifting and gratitude. Like on this slide, you see the different kinds of wealth: social wealth, material wealth, financial wealth, which is, I think, the most skewed aspect of wealth that the world covers. But like in Kernel, we have explored that there are all these different aspects of wealth, which can be like called as sources of capital, which have associated currency and which complex to many different interactions of many different attributes among all of us. So where do public goods fit into all of these things? So to phrase public goods effectively, like the economics definition is public goods are non-excludable and non-rivalrous. I think Aaron will go deeper into it later. So I'll just briefly cover that public goods are very different from common goods, which can like expire or which are scarce, or private goods, which are not even accessible to most people, or club goods, which are most of our NFT gated projects that we see, which requires a certain ownership of certain things to be able to access those goods. Whereas public goods like air, open source software, and all these things that are listed here, like Ethereum, poetry, clean air, digital public goods, like the open source system that I just showed you, public television, herd immunity in a society, Wikipedia, national defense, all these things are examples of public goods. And with the help of Web3 or emerging aspects of the web, which also includes AI increasingly, and open source, we can understand how to design our institutions in such a way where public goods and gifting and gratitude become part of the protocol itself. And that's what we would like to discuss with Aaron. And I consider Aaron as one of the deepest thinkers of our generation because of his varied background, which I showed earlier. So I'll hand it over to Aaron to take it over from here.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sid. It's a real privilege to be here and be part of the journey with all of you. QZ, it's great to reconnect with you as well. Always wonderful to know, that your work is continuing. I just thought I would say that when we started that gaming lab that you mentioned, I wanted to call it a serious games lab, but I think if we had the word games in that, we would not have got any funding from the Ministry of Finance, who tended to understand other words like training instead. So that's why we called it a simulation and training lab. And I was like, I'm happy to lose that battle to win the war of getting the amount of funding that I wanted to get the lab going. We can talk a bit about that as well, actually, how we create spaces, and sometimes may need to lose battles to win wars, in order to achieve much more of the abundance that we're trying to create here. So I wanted to start with the fact that I really want to cover three things in my sharing today. I have lived most of my public policy life working on kind of the making of policy. Now I teach about policy making in the school at the back here at Oxford. And so I wanted to talk a bit about the policy on gifts, and how governments can actually create institutions, rules, norms, and regimes within which gifting can at least become more prevalent than it has been before. When I read Lewis Hyde's book about 15 years ago, I remember being utterly transformed by it and thinking that so many more of us should be reading it, right? And then going deeper into Michelle Mauser's work and some of the work that Malinowski as an anthropologist did, I think we really start to see how powerful gifting actually is, right, as a concept. And I know you're all, I'm preaching to the choir here, so I won't do that more, but I want to just talk a little bit about how policy can be made for this. Then I wanted to talk about a life of policy as a gift itself, right? Like being in public service, and how for me that often felt like a gift to the world, and why that was always very meaningful for me. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about policy life as enabling the gifts that I seek to bring to the world. They're each slightly different, but they are, of course, interconnected. And in the spirit of bringing clarity, I thought it would be useful to kind of make sure we focus on each of these as separate entities. So, Sid, we can move to the next slide. I wanted to start with this, right? So Sid mentioned to you earlier that public goods are defined by their non-excludability and non-rivalry. And so the chart that he showed you is the table that is at the bottom half of this diagram, right? You see the same names there, right? Public goods, common pool resources, and private goods. Those are all very much a part of the economics literature today. But the thing I have been struck by more and more is that once we adopt a gifting mindset, then actually what used to be just the public goods by themselves, right, as in that top left corner of my table, you start to realize that they're not the only things that might exist there. Because you have possibly that's one section of it, which is why the top part there I talk about textbook public goods. But if you look at the bottom half of that additional cell in the table that I've added, then I think what can happen is sometimes we realize that the goods that are in there don't stay unchanged. Right? When you use them in common, when they are gifted to one another, or when we use them together, we start to realize things that are not possible when we use them by themselves. The term I use in my head here is that these are generative commons, right? They are commons because we use them together, but they are generative in that they don't stay static. The more we use them, the stronger, the more rich they actually become. And there are examples of this in the information space, in the digital and knowledge commons. We see this when it comes to relationships as well. Trust can be generative, but also anti-generative. If it is destroyed, then it gets destroyed exponentially. But when it exists, it can be really powerful and multiplicative. And certain structures, like public deliberation platforms and central government agencies, are also part of this process. And I'll reflect on these a little bit more in the next slide. So yeah, keep going, Sid. That's great. Because there are certain unique policy characteristics of gifts, right? We need to recognize that they're not the same as most of the goods that we consume, whether those are private goods or cinema tickets or laptops or chairs, right? The first thing about them is that they're constantly evolving. Right? The gifts are changing. In their generativity, they will keep evolving over time. They exhibit what I call input-output polymorphism. Figured a reasonably nerdy group like this one would enjoy a phrase like that. But really what I mean by that is sometimes it's not clear where the input ends and the output begins, right? It's much clearer in traditional production processes. But with this one, I mean, is data input or output, right? Is information input or output? It's both, right? And the fact is, I think we need to see the fact that these porous boundaries between input and output do exist. And that means that the nature of what it means to produce or to consume also changes. Right? The way in which we think about traditional economic roles and relationships will have to evolve. The third thing to mention is that you will have heard the phrase "the tragedy of the commons" before, right? Where you have kind of overgrazing or overcultivation of agricultural land or fisheries and forests. There is a tragedy of the generative commons as well, but this tragedy is not of overuse; it's a tragedy of underuse. Right? When we don't use our relationships well, when we don't use our digital commons and our knowledge commons well, when they are underused and they languish, right, in just basically underutilization, what we end up with is a real problem, right? Because there's so much unrealized potential there. The problem with this, of course, is that it's very hard to see, right, when something is unrealized. We know that it's a conceptual loss, but it's not something that we had and then lose. It's something that we never even possessed in the first place. But that's why I think it takes a lot of imagination to think about what exactly the quality of a generative gift might look like. Next, I talk about the fuzzy and dynamic edges. So basically, it's very hard to define these resources in a finite way, unlike with forests and fisheries and other more physical resources. But they have these dynamic edges, right, where we're dealing with things like information or the human relationships that are involved in gifting. And then finally, there's no stable equilibria, right? You can't optimize for gifting. You can't optimize for generativity in the way you would optimize with clear maximum or minimum equations in traditional economics. We have instead a very unstable set of equilibria, or rather no stable equilibria at all, right? And the fact is that we have to deal with a series of adaptive and emergent outcomes. The implications for this are quite manifold, and I thought I would mention them quickly. I noticed that Grace talked about policy and taxing about gifts, right? I think it is very, very true that often you can have governments that are unwilling to deal with these emerging phenomena because they go against so many of the instincts that governments have counted on to be familiar for the longest time. How we measure economic value, I think, has to change precisely because the input and output are no longer clear. And we need to figure out what it is to add value to a society, even if that is purely an input value and not a pure output one. Tax needs to change because how do we tax contributions, right, in a gifting economy? What do we do when we to tax the generativity of a particular set of goods? And we're facing some of this now, right? Data can exist as public infrastructure, but if it isn't used, then it doesn't generate value. But when it does generate value, who exactly can that value be ascribed to? That's much less clear, right? And it's not always obvious, I think, where exactly government policy needs to go. I think we can try and work on where the value added is done. But it means that governments have to move away from existing formulae, right, and really do some hard thinking about how they want to apportion economic value creation roles. Same thing applies to regulation, right? Because regulation is often done to minimize harm, but with the generative commons or gifting, you actually need to regulate in order to ensure an optimal use, to avoid underuse rather than avoiding overuse. And that takes a very different set of skills, right? Because here, normally regulators are there to tell you what you can't do. Here, a regulator would need to tell you what you should do, right? And why it's actually very valuable to undertake that. And it would take a very different set of instincts, I think, for folks to actually be able to meet some of these requirements. I also think that there are many implications for public participation, because we have generativity and what you have is the fact that the more the public gets involved in policymaking processes, the more they can be part of the deliberation that leads to the new possibilities that can be created by gifting. The very presence of someone in a participatory process can even be seen as a gift, right? Because they're giving their time, they're giving their attention, their energy, and their bandwidth to that process. And this links to the awareness that people need to build about systems approaches as well. Because when you have a strong sense of what a system needs overall, then you often have a stronger instinct around when gifting needs to happen versus when more traditional transactions might also need to take place. Because I don't think we want gifting to replace transactions entirely. Some things are nice to do precisely because they are simple, right, and unemotionally inflected. But some things you do want to bring gifts on board with, and that's where you need the systems approaches, I think, to do. So let me move to the next slide now. And now that we've talked about kind of the policy about gifts, let me talk a bit about the policy of the life of a policymaker as itself a gift. One of my favorite phrases comes from Senior Minister Teo Chee Hean here in Singapore. He used to be minister in charge of the civil service. And whenever we had him come speak to young students and ask them to think about coming to join us in government, he would tell them that one core quality, right, apart from enjoying some level of bureaucracy and enjoying documentation, he said you need to derive happiness from the happiness of others, right? I always found this such a wonderful phrase, in that you might be deeply introverted, but you derive a sense of meaning and happiness from the happiness of others, not just the maximization of your own. And for me, this was one big reason why I stayed in government for so long, and even now why I'm still involved in teaching. Right? Because for me, teaching about policy is a form of policy action as well. And public policy and public service are basically gifts, right? They are gifts because you are kind of sometimes throwing an idea out there into the world, and you know that the full effects of it may only be felt 10, 20 years down the road. You teach a child, you set up a new piece of policy infrastructure, and you are being part of what Lewis Hyde called the forward momentum of gifts. Right? For those of you, I don't know if you remember this that phrase that he used, right? But I love the idea of forward momentum, right? That in the exchange economy, we're looking backwards. Who gave who what? Who exchanged what with someone else? But in our world, in the world of gifting, we are interested much more in the sense of forward momentum. Who gets what we have, and how do we pay forward that? So I love that, because for me, policy was always a form of gifting, right? It wasn't just a job that got you paid. It was a form of gifting, and it brings you a way of being attached in a way to others, but also in a way that leaves you non-attached, right? Because you're kind of throwing a gift out there and saying, let it go where it needs to go, rather than feeling it needs to be something that belongs to you and that you need to continually steward. So a lot of this, I think, boils down to this phrase that Teo Chee Hean had around deriving happiness from the happiness of others, which I really wanted to share with all of you. If we can move to the next slide, Sid. I wanted to just show some examples of different aspects of policy that have gifting elements in them, right? Where the life of it involves a gift, but also this links to the kind of centralized work that I mentioned earlier, right? Which actually illustrate the concept of gifting even within a government. When you do futures, right, the kind of work that I have done, you are doing work that the system knows it needs, but which no individual part of the system has an incentive to provide. So if you like, these are like the public goods of an internal public service, but they are gifting elements as well, because when we do this work well, the entire system actually ends up benefiting. And you start to see that the ownership that any individual might have on this work actually dissipates after a while, because its effects start to apply elsewhere, and people suddenly develop ideas of their own without even realizing that they were prompted to by some of these core and centralized ideas. Same thing with the use of complexity science, or behavioral insights, or design thinking, all of which transcend different policy domains, but all of them involve good work when it is done, impacting and multiplying its effect into the broader system, right, that might be out there. So I've given you some other examples here, right? And citizen engagement, which I've talked about, and participation, digital transformation and use of tech, how we do nation branding, and how we are applying generative AI. All of these are examples where they can be underused if we don't do the work well. But if we do it well, then actually the multiplier effects of these systems, these exponentially beneficial effects, start to get realized in ways that were not even obvious, right, when we might have first started imagining these different outcomes. So we've been looking at policy, I guess, both as a life lived and as a series of actions, both of which I think can have impact, right, on how we approach gifting and actually create opportunities for us to bring our gifts into the world. So that leads me then to a couple of other slides. Sid, can we just move to the next one? I'm going to skip this one because I think it's less critical for now, but I'm happy to talk about it if anybody wants to dive into it. Let's move into the next one. Yeah. So to talk about the third aspect, about where policy life enables our gifts. I've always led a reasonably complex life. And I've known that I have gifts outside of the policy world, right? Gifts in facilitation work, which I often use in community building, gifts in writing and appreciating poetry. And I've often found that actually those gifts are things I do not control, right? And that's there in the Lewis Hyde book as well, right? The fact that the creative gift is literally a gift. It is given to you. You don't control it. You don't even get to steward it. You only have the opportunities to use that gift as best you can. And one of the glorious things about a life of public policy is, especially in Singapore, because it's not, you're not the most wealthy people in the world, but if we, the government pays reasonably well, right? And that means that when you're doing government work, you don't have to worry about bread and butter issues. You don't have to worry about taking care of your family. And that, in a lot of ways, has enabled many of us to kind of build and feed the other gifts that we have in our lives. Gifts like what the muses, who are the entities that I've put here on this slide, right, all bring, right? The gifts of creativity that they bring, whether it's in music or art or creativity and poetry, all of these, I think, are ideas about how we enable ourselves to embrace the gifts, right, that might be out there. And I do find that my policy life enabled me to do that a lot more, because it meant that when I was doing my poetry, I could approach poetry in the most untransactional way possible. I didn't have to rely on it to pay my bills. I didn't have to rely on my writing, and copyright fees that came out of it. I found ways to just let that work, right, be as pure in its intention as possible, and literally just be a gift that I bring to the world. When I publish my collections of poems, I've asked my publisher to keep the copyright that he would otherwise have given to me, and I told him, I said, go plan programs in schools, right? Do things that bring poetry to younger children. Honestly, just keep it for your next book, because it's not like lots of people buy books of poems. So sometimes that ability to gift other things, I think, is really important. And that leads then to what exactly I mean by untransactional poetry, right? Because I wanted to share this idea with you, because I don't think it's something that's unique to me, right? Many of us who write poetry try and keep our poetic gifts reasonably separate from the work we do that pays our bills, because we don't want to, in a sense, contaminate the gift, with something that is purely exchange related or transactional. So Ted Hughes, the former poet laureate of the UK, he writes a lot about what he calls foxes and nature, right? And in one of his finest poems is called A Thought Fox, right? Where the fox becomes a metaphor for his creative imagery and his creative process. So if you look at the third stanza here, right, the fox can't be seen at first. It is cold, and only delicately as the dark snow does its nose touch the twig and the leaf, and then the eyes serve a movement. And then suddenly, now and again, now and now and now, it starts to walk in the snow, and its path becomes legible to the poet. And then later, as we see in this last stanza, the poet says, the fox walks around, it minds its own business until, with a sudden, sharp, hot stink of fox, it enters the dark hole of the head. Now notice it's the head here, right? It's not a hole in the ground or a hole in the forest. It's a dark hole of the head, and the window is still starless, the clock ticks, but the page is printed. So the poem has come like a fox, right? And developed itself really as a gift, right? In a way that the poet has no control over. And it's just a process that has a life of its own. Now, the reason I share this with you is Hughes also later on in his life wrote a book called, a short essay called The Burnt Fox. And in the short essay, he describes how he was studying English literature in Cambridge, and he had made poetry his living, right? He had to study it in a scholarly, relatively transactional way, because that was the path he had chosen. And he describes how one night he was writing an essay, he couldn't think of anything to write, he was facing massive writer's block, and he falls asleep, but suddenly he gets woken up by footsteps outside his room. And he looks around and he sees a burnt fox, right? So the same fox image that we see in this poem, but in this case, it's a burnt fox. So this creature has the head of a fox, the body of a man, and it's burnt, right? Bleeding and just blood and burnt flesh everywhere. And this fox creature tells him, stop it, you are killing all of us. And what a wonderful, striking phrase that is, right? Because the image really there is of the creative process, the gift, speaking to him and saying, stop it, right? When you over transactionalize us, when you over exchange us, when you over commodify us, you are destroying the creative gift. And Ted Hughes then describes how the very next day, well, first of all, he wakes up and realizes it's a dream, but it was a very vivid dream. And he still hasn't written anything for his essay. And he goes and switches his major in school from English literature to archaeology, and anthropology, right? Which gave him enough space to still, I think, deal with human issues, but not have to study literary issues in ways that ended up compromising his overall gift. Now, Ted Hughes is, of course, a highly questionable personality in all sorts of ways. I see that Alia mentioned Sylvia Plath, in the comments, and he and his wife Sylvia Plath had the most rocky but also tempestuously passionate of relationships. But I do think that he had something going when he talked about the gift of poetry as being a fox, right? And the fox later on then speaking to him in a very direct way and saying, "Stop ruining the gifts by over transactionalizing what you do." I'll end off with a poem of my own, which looks at a similar issue, right? The fact that poetry is a gift and not something we can control. So, Sid, if we could move to the next slide, please.
Yeah, this one, right? Are you able to see?
This one, yeah, that's right. The one on, yeah. So this one is a poem I call Moth Caught in a Room. It's from my first collection called Morning at Memory's Border. And I remember just thinking about the creative process as being represented as a moth, right? So for Hughes, it was this fox, right? For me, it's more about the moth, right? The moth moves around the room, it ricochets from wall to wall, it's frenzied, it moves around, and it stains walls, right? As I put here in the poem, with the gold dust of its gunpowder wings, until at some point it just leaves the room, right? It's attracted to light for a while, but then eventually it moves somewhere else. And I describe it as careening towards the liberation of a street lamp. And for me, this is the gift of poetry, right? Not the moth itself, but because no room can contain that wheeling of this creature that is beyond control. And it leaves the mind's window and us kneeling, us being poets and others who engage in the work of creative gift. And we are scavenging for gold dust, right? That is the poetry that remains. It is not the same as the creature that we were trying to pin down, but it is beautiful unto itself, right? And it has a different kind of beauty. And for me, this captures my creative and gifting process, right? That sometimes I will not be able to pin it down. I won't capture the animal, but something else remains. And that something else is not just an echo. It's not just something to be vaguely content with, but it is something really beautiful unto itself that we can think of as art and gift, nonetheless. So I'd love to take any questions that you have about this, and I suspect it may well relate to some of the creative lives that all of you have, and I'd love to chat more about that. So I think that's the last slide. The next, yeah, I'll hand over back to you, and thank you again for the space and the time to share all this with you.
Thank you so much, Aaron. We'll just get into dialogue. I just wanted to summarize with one of the lines in the module where like the protocols that we develop are the gift themselves. And to Zaremba's point in the comments where she was sharing her grandfather's gifts, they were talking about a particular kind of love, like I think based on Camila's comment. So I think there's a part of the module which delves deep into this, in which they call upon this particular Greek word, which is called storch, and it denotes a tender care or affection which unites parents and children, and perhaps some teachers and their pupils. So, so yeah, I think all the points that Aaron mentioned, like we can now enter into a dialogue about how we can encode these values as parts of our protocols, and like go deeper into the questions that everyone has asked. So I'll hand it over to Vivek if he has any comments, and or we can start with questions and answers.
Yes, please. Anything in the Q&A world. I was thinking just if anyone would like to raise a hand, or if we could start with anyone who would like. I think Zaremba has been called upon here. Antonio had a question earlier. Kashani was asking as well. Please, anyone who'd like to begin. And Aaron, thank you so much. It really has been special.
Hi Vivek, hi Aaron, hi Sid, hi everyone. Thank you so much for this beautiful talk. I resonate a lot. I've been I've been kind of grown up in a culture where gift is something sacred. So, like when the significance of a gift means that there's time involved and there's care involved. So it becomes kind of like this object that, encompasses so much more than just the simple fact of like giving. So it's just very interesting to hear about like the repercussions or like the kind of the like how the ripples that a gift can have, because I think that in the long term it can really become it can really kind of affect many generations. And I think that, for example, I was reading about penicillin, how it was just an accident that it was discovered, and it has indeed saved billions and billions and billions of lives. So I think that my question here comes more also, I work on the Body Mind Guild. We're going to have a session afterwards, and I think of that time in which we focus on ourselves and we work in a somatic way as a gift that we give to ourselves. For so many times, it's not only about giving it to others, but also listening to ourselves and being able to gift ourselves and not be so hard on ourselves. And I know on a first hand about that. But then I also think about like all of this like gifts that go unnoticed, like for example, a mother that cooks every day for 35 years, or what like a janitor that comes a little bit earlier to a school to make sure that everything is clean, so that students of any sort can come to that space and experience a sort of standard of quality that doesn't matter which, it becomes intersectional. So I would love to just hear your thoughts about like this invisible giftings, and yeah, there's something very sacred about it. And I think that like what motivates a lot of times people to gift or to dedicate their time as a gift, and how we could, yeah, just would love to hear your thoughts about that. Thank you.
Did you want to do all of these? Shall we take a few actually? Maybe Sid? I think we might get some interesting intersections and synergies. We take maybe 3 at a time. I see Grace has her hand
Sure.
up. Do you
Sure,
want to go,
sure. Let's do
Grace? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard to talk like this module is about gifts, right? And we're not talking about theft, and we live in a kleptocracy, and like I'm just so aware of how much of the public resources and even the private resources are concentrated in the hands of few people. And I had somebody consult with me and say, how do we like this is a blockchain, right? How do we incentivize, which is like, we're going to pay you little, I call them dog biscuits. I'm going to give you some dog biscuits for the croc behavior, right? So how do we incentivize people to work on things where they are most inspired and creative? This was the question someone asked me, and I thought, what do you mean? Like, you don't have to incentivize people to work on what they're inspired to do. You don't have to incentivize people to be generous and kind and loving and give gifts. I mean, you kind of can't, in fact, if you give them a gift to be nice, right? And in the last person who spoke mentioned penicillin, and it just reminded me of ivermectin, because I first heard about this drug with river blindness, and it was discovered, like, it was this miraculous cure for river blindness, and it was patented, and the IP was given free to everyone, and it's been used all over the world for lots of diseases for a long time. And during the pandemic, this drug was demonized, and I don't know why. Like, I'm not going to make any claims about it, I don't know, but this thing that was given as a gift to the world was demonized by the company who had decided to make it public. And they decided to make it public when it was good for river blindness. But all of a sudden, when it was good for other things that they could make money on, it seemed to be demonized. And this is like, there's a game between the kleptocracy, right, stealing or getting your intellectual property, and this is true of the cathedral and the marketplace, right? With open source has been co-opted. Microsoft owns GitHub, GitHub, right? Microsoft owns GitHub, and Linux is owned by Red Hat and Microsoft, and it's like there's this kleptocracy that every gift that someone wants to give to the world is swallowed up and eaten by this kleptocracy, both corporate and governmental. And it's just, I don't know, like, it's a defilement of the sacred, I guess, is what I would want to say about it. And I think we have to talk about that along with the gift.
Thanks, Grace. Anyone else? Well, why don't we start there? I mean, those are both two very meaty questions already, and I'm sure they'll generate other thoughts. So Antonio, I loved your thoughts. I mean, I first of all, I think the idea of giving gifts to ourselves is really important. There is a possibility, I think, of over gifting in a way that drains ourselves, right? And one of the things I love in the theology of Henry Nouwen, the Dutch theologian, is he's got this great phrase: "You can't pour from an empty cup." And so, the more we want to give to the world, the more we also need to learn to receive from others. I think part of a gift literate, not just economy, right, but a gift literate community is knowing that hopefully that others can receive when we give to them, but also that we are willing to receive from them. And there will be times when we are depleted, tired, exhausted, drained, fatigued, and we will need the gifts of others to prop us up. Maybe just the gift of time, or maybe the gift of encouragement, the gift of listening. And I do think we want to create that space, right? So I agree with you there that we do need to learn to give gifts to ourselves and just not be shy about it, right? That can be done in ways that are not arrogant. It can be done in ways that actually can help the giver as well. And that's when you end up with this forward momentum, right? That the gift is received and then multiplied and given back almost. And Hyde talks a lot about this, right? The physical gifts of various indigenous tribes all over the world, those are physical and they move around. But these intangible gifts, right? Gifts of trust, gifts of love, gifts of affection can actually be much more powerful because they are, in my language, generative, right? If I give to you and you give to me, then suddenly something magical comes out of that energizes both of us, right? And that is not rivalrous because neither of what we give is diminished by the fact that we have just consumed it together. In fact, we haven't consumed because it has grown from the whole process. And there I think is this magic, right? This slightly different geometry and arithmetic of gifts, because it just isn't simply additive anymore. Having said that, I do think we want to be careful about the idea that everything should be seen as gift. It's a beautiful idea in a lot of ways, especially if you bring that into the work that you do. But that can also be really tiring. There are probably days when you want the simplicity of a transaction, right? You go to the supermarket, you get some stuff. I mean, sometimes it can be lovely to have a chat, right, with someone who's a cashier. But there are days when you might also just want to have a bit of time for yourself, right? Or you might want to stay, be courteous and not at all rude to someone who drives a cab for you. But there may not be the energy to turn that into an enormous, deep gift relationship between the pair of you. And sometimes I think we need to know either when we ourselves or others are not in a space to receive some of the gifts that we have. I love to give time, right? My love language is time, it's words of affirmation. But I have been with friends who've said to me, hey, we just got too close too fast and I'm not ready to receive this. And part of me is sad about that, because I always feel like, is this a you problem or is this a me problem? But maybe it's neither of that, right? Maybe it's just that they aren't ready at that point, and I'm okay to just say, all right, I've tried to give you something. It doesn't need to be reciprocated to be honored. And if you choose to not take it the way it was meant, then that's okay, right? Because maybe people aren't ready, they aren't in a position to consume or to receive the gifts in particular ways. yeah, so I think that's a useful cautionary thing to remember, right? That we might have gifts, but we need to give at a pace that others can actually receive. Otherwise, it's like consuming from a fire hose, and it can actually become quite oppressive. Grace, I love what you described, and I think you're absolutely right. That there are times when the language of incentives, of capitalism, of optimization ends up really desecrating what could otherwise be a really powerful gift contribution. And I think one place that we see it in the policy world is, governments often try to encourage people to have babies, right, in different parts of the world. And Japan tries this. Then some of the Nordic countries have done it. Singapore definitely have to try because we just aren't replacing ourselves. And one thing you realize is that the affection and love of family formation, right, the storge that Sid referred to in his slide earlier, is literally bastardized, right? When you introduce consumption and financial incentives into things. People don't want to be told, "I'll give you X thousand dollars if you have a kid." They want to have a kid for the incentive, the intrinsic motivations that brings. And I think that's exactly the same kind of instinct that Ted Hughes had when his fox told him, stop it, you're killing all of us," right? Because it's that same kind of purity of intent that just isn't allowed to be there when these incentives come along. And I think part of it happens because exchange economies are threatened by gift economies, right? The very basis of what an exchange is obviated when we start exchanging gifts with one another. And that's why I think it's really important to know when actually our interests as a society are served by the simplicity and, in a sense, the anonymity of exchange, but when we also need our deeper selves, right, our souls, our gifts to be fed, and those should not be interfered with, I think, by more capitalist processes. Am I a socialist? In a lot of ways, yes, right? But I do believe that you want to use government funding to enhance human life as much as you can. But I think there are certain instances, as I said in my response to Antonio, where sometimes you probably are actually better off with the elegance and simplicity of a capitalist transaction without having too much emotion kind of thrown into it. So it's a delicate kind of polarity, if you like, right? You're kind of juggling two ends and two extremes here. But broadly, I do agree with you, Grace, that there can be many instances where that contamination that happens of gifting is actually something we want to try and avoid as much as possible. Camilla and Zaremba.
Hello. Yeah. It's I'm trying to figure out how to start this off because gifts are it's so literal but not, right? Like I think when we think of gifts, sometimes we think of the physical object, but saying a phrase or being there, quality time is a gift. And some things that come to mind, sort of in response to everything that's been brought up, is culture, right? Legislation, policy, and what else? Like equity, right? Because I remember there's like this phrase that says, some people, if they see there's a whole pizza pie there, will take two slices because there's a whole pie there, and others will take just one because others haven't eaten yet. And I think about that a lot, right? About how some cultures, I guess, how some cultures encourage one way of, I guess, consuming or giving or showing up in gift culture. And then when you were talking about how your love language, Aaron, is, I guess, like quality time, right? And not everyone has a capacity for it, has different ones. It makes me think of equity a lot because I remember just talking to a friend of mine about relationships, and I was like, "Oh, like, what's your love language?" And she says, "It depends." And I feel like that was the most honest answer because I don't think our love languages are the same all the time. So we had a discussion. I was like, "What do you mean by it depends?" She's like, "Well, if I'm really overwhelmed at work or I don't really need a hug. I need someone to help me with something, or I need someone to help me do dishes, right? Just like, if someone has a lot of financial resources, let's say, at the time, maybe they don't need a financial incentive to have a child, right? But they might need more emotional community support. And yeah, it just makes me think a lot about, I don't know, those like equity, how do we build a culture in which gifts are understood, but also appreciated when they're different? How do we hold space for different ways of giving gifts and receiving gifts. And yeah, I don't really have like a poetic last thought to it because there's always going to be people who, I guess, ruin a good thing. But I think that when there is a culture of respect, right? Like it makes me think of like my childhood, even when for me growing up, I would have family members say, "Oh, like don't take too much because other people haven't eaten yet," right? Or, "Oh, you should give this to that person because they don't have that." In some environments that I've worked in, there's been a culture of gifting, congratulations, right? And you kind of just pass that along to everybody. And it naturally creates this momentum of just a gift that keeps on giving.
Love it. Thank you, Camilla. Thanks. Zaremba?
Hi. So I think my point actually is sort of inspired and to some degree also repeating the previous points. For example, Camilla's or Grace's about thinking about a system where not everybody has the same approach to gifts and giving. So potentially, if there's some assumption about how the gifts will be used, but people in the system have different approaches, then that assumption might backfire. So I'm curious, how do you think about this in terms of system design?
Brilliant. These are great questions. And you're quite right. I asked myself as a thought experiment, would everybody be interested in gifting? Or in this instance, would they want to be purveyors and receivers of gifts more if they knew that everyone else was going to do it? And the answer is probably yes, right? I mean, so that's what makes this an interesting collective action problem, because if we know that others are going to renege, then we end up creating protective mechanisms around ourselves. But if we know that there is going to be more of that culture, then we I think end up playing more into it. So I think both Grace and Camilla has alluded to this in her remarks. Grace has mentioned it in her comment as well about culture, right? That when you know the culture is going to be out there that supports gifting, you will probably end up doing more of it. I think that's broadly true, right? And the hard bit in this, of course, is knowing that the world is, unfortunately, not just full of gifters, right, but can be full of assholes as well. Not to put too fine a point on it, right? And if you think about some of the ways in which companies function, right, one of the rules there: don't be an asshole, but don't get taken for granted either. And I think the general idea there is gift where you can, right, but don't do it in a way that creates martyrdom, because I think that can become problematic. There can be a real beauty, as one or two of the messages in the chat alluded to, that you just give unconditionally and say, all right, let's see where this goes. And if you're in a position to be able to do that, I think that can be really powerful. And that's part of what I meant when I said that life I led in public policy was very enabling for me, right? It allowed me to say, all right, I'm going to give unconditionally on certain things, and it's okay if people are not interested in either reciprocating or creating gifts of their own. But I think it would be far more powerful if we could try and create an overall set of ecosystems and culture that leads to some of these outcomes. So then that leads to Zaremba's really powerful question, right, around what do you then do about system design? And this is the hard bit, because you're trying to design for greater, not perfection, but perfectibility, right, of human nature, and not acknowledge that we're designing for the better angels of our nature, knowing that there might be some people who will abuse those systems nonetheless. And I think one aspect of the system design, I think, has to be that we make very clear what we see as desired behaviors. And then kind of in the spirit of how Eleanor Ostrom deals with governance of the environmental commons, we make very clear what the kind of collective sanctions will be for deviant behavior. Because I think there has to be some of that sense of, we will not accept certain levels of behavior, or you will not accept standards not being met, right? And in the environmental case, there are very objective standards around this, right? Throw back fish that are below a certain size so that you continue the sustainability of a fishery. Don't cut down trees beyond a certain size or below a certain size because you want the forest to regenerate. And I think we need to find similar views of this around what exactly gifting culture can look like, right? Don't steal, right? Don't hoard, I mean, those have to become important aspects of the behavior here, because I think if we don't do that, then that's when you end up with a few, kind of negatively behaving qualities ending up contaminating the rest of the system for everyone. So I think that's where system design needs to happen, right? There has to be a sense of collective deliberation around what it is you want to prioritize, an agreement on what sanctions will look like if you deviate from that behavior, and then a collective agreement that you will enforce some of that as well, right? So Grace has called that eliminating sociopathic behavior. And I agree with that. And I think what we need to do is basically set in place the collective norms to allow for that. But at the same time, knowing that we are human, right, and therefore fallible in certain instances, we have to plan for what happens when there is failure, right, or when there is some kind of sociopathic behavior, and have the ability to respond as a collective in those instances. Zaremba, I'd love to hear if you have any other thoughts on that, because I suspect you have thoughts on system design too. So if you can share some of those with us, I'd love to hear those. And then we can go to Justin. Yeah.
So I'll talk very quickly because I have tendency to just hog the mic. And I always have a lot of thoughts. But the thing that I was specifically thinking is that often when you think about the society for which you are designing the system, you try to learn as much as you can about this sort of society, this community. So you might be able to come with some sort of like descriptive or sort of numerical values, in sense of we can expect maybe 5% of antisocial behavior here, or we might expect some sort of distribution of behaviors. So with that, you might be able to build a system. Let's say you expect 5% of some sort of bad behavior, and the system from the simulation, you think it needs to be able to survive 10% of this misbehavior. And I think it works well with many things, but with such sort of fundamental things as approach to gifts and giving, which is also connected to approaches to resources, power, and entitlement to making maybe decision for others. I can't actually think about how you could try to turn that into usable assumptions for designing policy around, for example, common goods and so on.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I have some thoughts, not solutions, but at least some initial thoughts. Justin, do you want to go as well, though, before I jump in?
Yeah, I can go as well.
Please.
Yeah, you kind of already have done this, Aaron, but I have a tendency to bring some poetry in, and I thought maybe I'll just do that right here and now, if that's cool. Sweet.
Please.
And maybe just a thought or two on the other side of it. Yeah, so the poem is by Raina Marie Roki, and it says, Earth, isn't this what you want? To arise in us invisible? Is it not your dream to enter us so wholly, there's nothing left outside of us to see? What, if not transformation, is your deepest purpose? Earth, my love, I want it to, believe me. No more of your springtimes are needed to win me over. Even one flower is more than enough. Before I was named, I belonged to you. I see no other law but yours, and I know I can trust the death you will bring. And something that really struck me at the beginning of the call was when Sid was putting the titles of some of the sections for this module together, and it was the gift of no paradigms is perfection. And I was just kind of listening to the different names of like gift economies and generative commons and and cultural commons and infinite gardens. And I was just really realizing how the thing that we're at this threshold where like we're sensing that the thing that we're sensing has no name, because it's kind of being born through us as beings of the earth. And something about the nature of like the creative genius, the freedom of expression, the unique offer of value, doing so in a way that is like selfishly selfish because you can't help but do it, but you do it because it's the only thing that you just can't not give those gifts in just right ways, because they're the things that compel you to be alive, and service in the ways that you are. That kind of energy felt so foreign, and I was just kind of I was just sensing the possibility of that thing being not here now, although obviously you're designing policy in ways that are possible, or technology to be these things, but also by us kind of speaking to it and sensing into it and naming it as a thing, how we can kind of recognize that maybe this is something like the earth working through us, and that there's a real kind of capacity to relax and breathe into that because it is here now, something like that.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Justin. Let me respond quickly to Zaremba's comment, which I thought was very powerful, and then I'll come to yours, Justin. Zaremba, I had two thoughts as I was listening to you. One is, I don't know if we're designing systems for a binary of gift versus don't gift. I think you actually kind of need three categories here. There's gifting behavior, which we want to encourage, celebrate, not necessarily incentivize, but find ways to encourage, celebrate, honor it. And then at the other extreme, there is the sociopathic behavior that is unacceptable, which we sanction and find ways to hopefully get rid of as far as possible. And then there's probably going to be kind of a middle range of acceptable behavior to which we are relatively neutral. We're not going to celebrate it necessarily. If someone doesn't push themselves particularly, they may not gift, but they may not be anti-gift either, right? And I wonder if that needs to be a space which we allow for as well. Only because for some folks, and I think Camilla alluded to some of this as well. I mean, there are days when we may not have much of a love language, or we may just be tired. We may not have much space to give anything. And I think allowing for the fact that there is gifting or not gifting, or in the case of the poem that Justin read, right, just to kind of chill a little bit and let the earth do what it needs to do, that in itself can be okay behavior too. And I think functional societies are going to have that, because what I suspect is that, you guys are familiar with the diffusion of innovation curve, right? The idea of innovators, early adopters and stuff. My suspicion is that gifting is one of those things that is probably going to end up being done by about, if we're lucky, about the early half of a system, right? So the innovators, early adopters, and early majority. And there's always going to be some laggards, right? Because societies are built on some level of dialectical force. I think there are going to be some people who will just keep pushing back on some of this and say, oh, this is unrealistic, it's idealistic, it's not going to work. And we want to push against that as much as possible. I think keeping in mind the three categories I mentioned, right? Desirable behavior, acceptable and unacceptable behavior will help us to plan around that. But it may not be something we will attain with perfection, because we are humans, like I said, after all. And one thing that helps us get closer to perfection, though, I think, is big tech. Right? There are not big tech, and there are opportunities with things like big data and technological techniques that help us get closer. I mean, the possibilities of kind of financial malfeasance, for instance, in companies or even in governments. Once you automate a bunch of things like expense claiming, for instance, you still can have kind of corruption and kind of false claims, but they're much harder to do, right? Because if you corporatize on Uber or Lyft or in Singapore or Grab, most of your claims, then a really smart person is still going to be able to cheat the system, but it's much harder to do, right? Because it's just so much more difficult, I think, to falsify the fact that you did go from point A to point B and it's captured in the geospatial repository of information. So I think that there are little things like that that can allow us to use tech in a much more intelligent way, where we hopefully can get closer to where we'd like to be. Although it may still be difficult, like I said, because of the way that, I think if you assume that humans are kind of situated along that normal distribution of the innovation curve, then there are always going to be some laggards, right, in the overall system. Justin, I love the poem that you brought up, right? So that's from Rilke's Do We Know Elegy, the ninth Do We Know Elegy, right? I'm a huge Rilke fan as well, right? I carry his Book of Hours with me pretty much wherever I go. Um, and I think that you stopped by at the line about the death he would bring, right? But the next few lines are really powerful too, when he says, "See, I live on what? Childhood and future are equally present. Sheer abundance of being floods my heart." And that language of abundance, I think, is something I suspect all of us are trying to inch more towards, right? And it's hard, right? It brings with it all the challenges that Grace and Zaremba have talked about so far, and the kind of imperfections that Miller mentioned. But I think we want to move towards it nonetheless. Right? And I think of this as kind of the fact that we never truly attain. Some things are meant to be destinations, and our job is to just keep getting closer and closer to them. And we don't lament the fact that we haven't reached them. We just try and keep putting in the work to get closer and closer. There's a line from the Jewish Ethics of the Fathers, right, which talks about how we achieve tikkun olam, right, the gradual perfection of the world. And one of the rabbis says, it is not for you to complete a task, but neither are you at liberty to desist from it. And quite honestly, that keeps me going, right? I know that I don't live in a perfect world of gifting, but I will keep trying anyway. I know that I don't live in a world of perfect futuring or perfect innovation and transformation, but I'll try anyway, so that the next person who comes along hopefully has a slightly less difficult time than I do. And maybe this will sound a little bit too zen. I'm not sure. I'd love to have pushback on it. I'd love to hear it. But I kind of feel like that helps us to kind of both live with ourselves and harness the restlessness that we might be feeling about trying to attain a little bit of a better world. Vienna, you've got your hand up.
Hey guys. Oh, it's so dark here. So I'll first mention, you mentioned spirituality at the end there. So I was talking to some friends a couple of days ago about to be honest, like in Buddhism, there's like 5 precepts, right? And he asked how many precept Buddhists I am, and I told him that I'm a 0 precept Buddhist because I don't think that I could even hold like the first precept, which is like not killing, because of me participating in the financial system, and for me, like this idea of like financial poetry is actually an enticing one, like where I think like Justin, you were sharing that like letting the earth like flow through you, like to me, like that's also a way that we can reconcile seemingly paradoxical stuff, like if one of our failure mode currently in the financial system is not modeling like externality, like so what if we could model that, and what if we could actually conceive of ourselves as like agent of Sid knows that I talk about the thermodynamics a lot. Like so I imagine that financial poetry and financial thermodynamics to be a reality in the future, I just want to put that little thing into the system design as well, because in the past I've also worked on using you could say eigentrust, but like basically just like crowd prediction to reconcile subjective and objective prediction, and kind of as a way of like battling the kind of problems that I see some people talk about in the chat. And because for me, fundamentally, gift and relationship is the basis of finance. And financial poetry, in a way, is a play, like casting a spell on like a play on time. And it's a play on relationship and a way to signal how close I want to be with you. Although unfortunately, the game is kind of rigged right now. And I'm hoping like, to me, like that is the journey that I want to be on. And it's great to hear you talk about policy as gift, because I am also literally like in the process of like engaging with like institutional players in Malaysia while organizing an Ethereum conference here. And I'm just like, oh, should we like be like engaging in long-term stuff here, and eventually, like I think we are gonna do that. But it's also like, yeah, it's extremely hard, and there's so many different interest group to reconcile. So anyway.
Yeah, no, Vienna, I mean, those are very powerful and I think very prescient thoughts. I'll just say one thing, which you made me think about, right? And when you talk about modeling externalities, which I agree with 100%. And the thing is, we have the data now to do this, right? And the techniques to do it. Maybe we didn't 20 years ago, but we can impute externalities and estimate them far better now than we used to. So that I think is important. And the other thing that I would add is, there's a lot of that we can do now with agent-based modeling for the kinds of systems that we are trying to build here, right? And actually test where exactly do these norms lie? How large are the three groups that I mentioned, right? The ones doing desirable, acceptable, and unacceptable behavior. We can model all of that. And I think the more we try and do that, right, as much as we're also trying to model things like fake news and the spread of rumors, the more we are able to use tech to come and get on our side here, right, rather than just as a source of rapacious exploitation of the systems. So I think that's absolutely critical. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up that point about modeling, because I think that's for me where the world of gift and the world of tech meet, right? And as I love that slide in Sid's deck, right, where he talks about Web3 principles and personal principles. Because the first time I looked at those, I was like, oh my God, there's just so much parity between these things, right? And I hope you're exploring those parities within your lives as well. But I do think that we have so much more hope now for realizing some really tangible aspects of a gift community than we actually did even 10 or 15 years ago. I'm very conscious about time, Sid, so I think I might hand back to you now.
Yeah, so we are at the end of our scheduled time for this particular fireside conversation. But we have many questions in the chat, which we would like to discuss further in the Slack threads, and maybe in the future we can revisit these conversations. So I wanted to just thank Aaron for coming here and for graciously giving us his time and knowledge and going through the chat and following all the threads while speaking and sharing in front of us. So I just wanted to ask, do you have any closing thoughts or a piece of poetry or anything that you want to leave us with?
Yeah, it's a big start, isn't it? I mean, the first thing I would say is I'll go back to that quote that I just mentioned, around the Jewish ethics of the fathers, because I think it's easy to despair at the state of the world, and so easy to just feel like we're never going to get there. And honestly, I do get to bed at night thinking, all right, we might never get there. Actually, I get really scared sometimes, but I feel like I'm at least trying. And I'm in with people who do try, right? So that's why I said when you asked if I could come share this with you guys, I was like, yes, of course, right? Because the more like-minded communities like ours find each other, the better off we become. Even as we deal with the imperfections that are out there. I'm gonna kind of mirror Justin on this and end off with a Rilke poem too, right? From the Book of Hours, like I said, which is kind of his love poems to God. And it's not very long, but I think it captures some interesting things from our discussion today. He says, I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world. I may not complete this last one, but I give myself to it. Circling around God, around the primordial time, been circling for thousands of years, and still I don't know, am I a falcon, a storm, or a great song? I saw some of you kind of nodding, but I'm glad that some of you are familiar with it. But for the ones who aren't, the reason I share this with you is because I find that actually I've been thinking about these issues all my life, right? Like when I was in school, I was always interested not just in being in class, but doing things that contributed to a larger sense of community. When I was in work in Singapore, in the government in Singapore, I was always interested in what contributes to the whole of the system, never just my agency's work. I moved to Oxford partly because it seemed like a way to contribute globally to capability building and not just to a specific country's work. And I feel like those are the widening circles of my life. And I hope that yours are also widening, right, in ways where your reach keeps getting bigger, even as the nature of the problems will also then seem bigger because you just start having a much wider aperture. I don't know whether I'm a falcon, a storm, or a great song either, but I do know that I feel a much greater sense of what I'm supposed to be doing when I come to communities like this. So thank you for having me, and I hope that you all find a better sense of your own falconness, stormness, or great songness over time. And I hope
Thank
you find that
you.
all your gifts well realized. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Aaron. And we'll be sharing the recording for this conversation later within the kernel chat first. So I'll stop the recording now. Thank you everyone for coming.